Welcome back to Slumber IV. I'm not really sure how I can explain today's video. Missing people, monsters, unexplained events. This video has it all. I'd like to give a huge thank you to all the writers who allowed me to share their stories with all of you. As always, their links can be found in the description. Remember, you can send your own stories to rylhstories@gmail.com if you would like to have a story featured on the channel. Also, I'd just like to say thank you all for the ongoing support. I know I'm always thanking you guys, but even in my absence and even when I take breaks or whatever, you guys are always showing me a ton of it, and I appreciate it a lot. But enough rambling. I know you guys are here for the stories, and that's totally fine. So I hope you enjoy them, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. A decade or so ago, I lived in a town where people kept going missing. I'm not going to name that town. I don't live there anymore. I'm never going there again. And neither should you. I don't know what's happened there since I left. I don't know what exactly was going on there before I left. What I do know, what I stumbled upon, is enough for me. This chain of events began when a teenage girl named Alicia Johnson went missing. I hadn't known her beforehand, but after her face was plastered all over the news, everybody did. It was a big deal, of course, but the police ended up deciding that she was a runaway. Apparently she'd had problems at home, and she disappeared in the middle of the night with no signs of any sort of struggle or foul play. Her parents were devastated, of course, but nothing turned up. It was as if she had just vanished overnight. The next disappearance was a middle-aged man, husband and father. Same deal, the family went to bed and in the morning he was just gone. The next week, 2 more people disappeared. This was when the town became noticeably more tense. Some people wrote it off as a coincidence, but others thought something was going on. Police presence expanded. People didn't go out alone at night. I didn't see the point. It's not like anybody was disappearing from the streets. I just bought deadbolts for my doors and started to keep my gun loaded. A strange feeling of unease settled over the town. One more disappearance came the next week, and another 3 days after that. But then, as soon as they had begun, the disappearances stopped. Over the course of a month or so, 6 people had vanished from their homes without a trace, and nobody had any idea why. The police were completely baffled. The months passed on and the mystery was never solved. The tension surrounding our town slowly faded, while the families of the missing people either dealt with their own grief or kept holding on to hope. The rest of our lives began to return to normalcy. Around 5 months after the disappearances stopped, I began to get into urban exploration because of a friend of mine. Jack, not his real name, had been trying to find interesting places to check out, and when he asked me to tag along, I decided to humor him. Over a few weeks, we'd explore the usual kinds of areas: rundown buildings, abandoned construction sites. Once we even found a cave. But of course, this was all nothing compared to Jack's latest big find. One day he told me there was some kind of old, abandoned building isolated deep in the woods outside of town. I don't know how he found out about it. Apparently most people didn't even know it existed. I sure as hell didn't. So naturally we agreed to meet up there the next evening and check it out. The night came around and I headed out to the site. After our first few expeditions, Jack and I started just meeting up on location. We decided it was both simpler and more exciting. After a half hour of stumbling through the woods, I finally arrived at the clearing, and there in front of me was the building. Jack had been right. There was no way this building had been maintained in at least 20 years. I couldn't even tell what it had been used for in the first place. It was so run down and overgrown with vegetation. There was some sort of sign in front. but the text was completely faded and illegible, lost to the years. Strangely, I'd gotten there before Jack. He was very punctual about these things, and he always arrived first. After all, he was the real enthusiast. I had mostly just been tagging along. I pulled out my phone. Thankfully, even out in the middle of the woods, I still had service. I shot Jack a text, sat down on a log, and just took in the atmosphere of the building before me. The air hung thick and silent in the little clearing. It wasn't completely dark yet, but the sun was threatening to dip behind the treetops, and the shadows were slowly creeping forward. I began to shiver. I hadn't realized how cold it was getting. Glancing at my phone again, I realized 15 minutes had passed with no response from Jack. A little annoyed, I got up and paced around the building. If Jack was going to be this late, I sure as hell wasn't going to wait outside in the cold for him. When I found a door, I twisted the doorknob, and was pleased to find that the door opened with no fuss. I dug my flashlight out of my pack and stepped inside. The interior of the building was just as run down and nondescript as the outside. Bare concrete floors and walls betrayed no hints of what this bizarre place actually was. As I swept my flashlight beam around, the cold continued to bite through my jacket. It certainly wasn't any more comfortable in here than outside. I glanced at my phone again. Still nothing. Okay, Jack. Fuck you too, I grumbled. I tapped a quick, "Where you at, dude?" and hit send, and then, after another moment, added on, "I'm going without you." I wouldn't have come if I'd known I was going to deal with that shit, but I'd already made the trip through the damn woods. I might as well take a look around. I'd make it quick, though. There was a faint, strange smell in the air, and it bothered me for reasons I couldn't quite place. I stepped through the rooms one by one. Still nothing. I was beginning to think this building had never been used for anything at all. Maybe they had just finished construction and were unable to sell it because nobody had any use for a building in the middle of nowhere. Aside from a few dark stains in the floors and walls I couldn't identify, this place was completely barren. Not even any bugs. What a dud. Then I found the stairway down to the basement. I carefully made my way down the cold concrete steps. My flashlight cut through the darkness at the bottom to reveal a doorway, and something glinting on the floor beyond. Finally, something interesting. I finished my descent and stepped through the doorway to discover the glinting had been caused by shards of broken glass all over the floor. The darkness made it difficult to judge, but it seemed like the basement was just one big room that spanned the entire base of the building. Worse yet, the bizarre smell was stronger now. I resolved to check out the basement and leave. The source of the glass became immediately obvious. Near the wall stood the shattered remnants of some kind of large glass cylinder. The base seemed to be some kind of machine that I couldn't identify, covered in dials and lights that had long gone dead. From the mechanical base, the glass cylinder extended, about 4 or 5 feet in diameter, up to around the height of my waist, where its thick walls quickly ended in shattered, jagged edges. Mystified, I drew closer. One of the jagged edges was caked in blood and hair. I instantly jumped back and let out an involuntary "what the fuck?" In retrospect, I think it was that noise that caused it. If I had just silently turned around and walked back up those steps, I would have just gone home. Unnerved, but immediately none the wiser. But right after I let out that cry, a wheezing groan emanated in response from the darkness deeper in that room. I slowly turned towards it, my trembling beam of light slowly cutting across the concrete floor, until after a few long seconds the source of the noise was illuminated. At first, my mind refused to process what I saw. There was a second glass cylinder in that basement, similar to the first. It had the same bizarre mechanical base, but this one was unbroken. the tube extending all the way to the ceiling. Inside the glass was a giant mass of flesh, grotesquely twisted and misshapen. A nonsensical, obscene jumble of limbs and faces riddled the abomination. Or in some places, parts of faces, with haphazard eyes blinking open, or isolated mouths stretching wordlessly. Some of the structures weren't even recognizable, instead just forming bony protrusions of hairy tumors. Some areas were covered with skin, others exposing pulsating arteries and muscle fibers. Others seemed to somehow blend together, deforming and reforming in impossible ways. It looked like a group of people had been melted and fused together. The monster was suspended above the bottom of the container, hanging from the ceiling by sinewy ropes of flesh, anchored in position. It dripped fluid from a few places, which ran down its slimy form and joined the pool of bile, blood and all at the bottom of the tube. And though I somehow managed to retain my sanity at the sight of this thing, once my light landed on it, it began to move. The limbs jutting from the fleshy core began to move every which way. Some began to pound and scrape at the glass. Some walked their fingers along the beast itself, or scratched and ripped at its own skin, and others just jerked randomly out of control. Some hands had too many fingers, others too few. Some of the deformed faces began to open bulbous, sightless eyes, or open their mouths to speak. But mercifully, they seemed to be almost incapable of producing noise. Other faces remained motionless, clearly long dead. But the worst ones were the ones that still looked human, because they looked directly at me. As I locked eyes with the many faces of the formless flesh, I made a horrible realization. I recognized these faces. I stood there trembling, unable to stop my gaze from traversing the monstrosity before me, until I made eye contact with Alicia Johnson. She had been the first to disappear. Her head was protruding from a slimy, pulsating mass of muscle, anchored in position by veiny lengths of tissue that somehow melded seamlessly with her own. But despite her face being held still, her eyes connected desperately with mine, and her mouth opened, saying, "Help me." I took a step back. Her voice sounded so strained and worn. I was amazed she could even speak. I gaped back at her wordlessly, unable to respond, as she continued to stare at me. Other faces around her seemed to awaken and come alive, and more moans and wheezing began to build up. Looking at all the faces, I realized there was more than 6 people in there. And that's when it started to scream. I don't know which mouth it was. Maybe it was more than one. But the horror in the tube let loose an unearthly, despondent shriek the likes of which I could never have imagined. I instantly spun around and bolted through the doorway, desperately scrambling away, leaving the chaos of forms behind to thrash at its glass prison. Worst of all, as I sprinted out of the basement and up the stairs, I could hear Alicia's hoarse voice cutting through the cacophony. "Please help me, don't leave me here. Please, please, just kill me. Please." Until I was out of the building, sobbing as I ran through the forest. I left town that night. I sprinted straight home, put as many of my belongings in my car as I could in 30 minutes, turned off my phone and just drove. I never returned. I couldn't bear the thought of what I had seen in that tube. I had so many questions, but I didn't want to know the answers. I just needed to get as far away as possible, even though it meant abandoning my house, my job, my life. I didn't care. Never in my life will I return to that town. At first I was unsure if leaving had been the right decision. My sleep-deprived, panic-fueled brain was still full of doubt. Did I overreact? Could I have just tipped off the police and returned to my life? The disappearances had stopped months ago. Maybe whoever or whatever had done that was gone. Had I just upended my life needlessly? I got my answer in a motel near the interstate. After 2 days of traveling as far and as fast as possible, I finally needed to rest. I got into my room, collapsed on the bed, and turned on the TV, hoping to take my mind off it and finally get some much-needed sleep. As I was flipping through the channels, the sight of Jack's face made me immediately stop. Missing Jack Oren. Last seen 2 days ago. Car found near the woods. Otherwise, no leads. Jack had gotten there before me after all. The next morning, I kept driving. My neighbor was the first to go missing. I didn't pay much attention to the others on my floor, so it wasn't until the police showed up outside her door, the one just across from mine, that I knew something was wrong. The woman's son had called the landlord, Mrs. Fisher, when his mother failed to answer her phone. Sadly, the investigation was over before it even began. The police had 0 leads, and there was no real, incriminating evidence to speak of. Just another unsolved case. The situation became much more odd about 3 weeks later. Somehow the woman's mail ended up in my mailbox by mistake. I didn't know what else to do with it, so I took it over to Mrs. Fisher so she could take care of it. She looked confused as she read the address. B16, that's strange, she said. No one's lived there for years. That can't be right, I replied. What about that woman who vanished a few weeks back? Mrs. Fisher looked at me as if I were from Mars. What woman? I pointed to the envelopes on her desk. She turned to her computer, quickly typing in the woman's name before turning back to me. I don't have that name on file. Maybe it was meant for a different building. The maintenance man came next. I was leaving for work when I saw him enter the now empty apartment. I knew why he was there. Tenants were complaining about noises coming from the air vents, mainly in the vacant space, and Mrs. Fisher was surprised to find they hadn't been serviced in quite a while. I returned from work to find one of my other neighbors arguing with her. "There's something in those vents, I tell you," he shouted. "Can't get any damn sleep because of it." Mrs. Fisher simply nodded, typing away at her computer. "I understand, Bob. I'll call maintenance as soon as possible." "Didn't you just call them today?" I piped up. "I saw a guy go in there earlier." Both Bob and Mrs. Fisher agreed that no maintenance man had come to the complex. Mrs. Fisher recalled phoning someone, but after checking her most recent calls, she decided it must have been someone else. The noises in the vents got louder and more frequent as the weeks went by. More maintenance workers entered the empty apartment and failed to come back out. Eventually, the company just stopped answering Mrs. Fisher's calls altogether. Bob was furious. I didn't know him all that well, but I've spent enough time in the building to know he was the type of person to take matters into his own hands. I was pulled away from a movie by the sound of his attempts to break down the door across the hall. Being a rather bulky guy, it didn't take him long. I knew it wasn't my business to interfere, but I knew something wasn't right about that apartment. The least I could do was watch his back for him, buddy system and all that. The first thing I noticed when I stepped in was the dust. It covered nearly every surface in a thin coat, and the air was just as musty and old. I could even make out the outlines of some footprints, likely left behind by the missing maintenance men. Everything except the furniture was gone, the woman's belongings having been passed on to her son. "Damn, this thing's spacious," Bob's voice rang out. I turned the corner just in time to see his shoes disappear into the vent, the cover sliding back into place. Instinct took over, and I quickly ran to the vent and yanked the cover off. It was definitely a face that greeted me, and it was definitely human, but it definitely wasn't Bob, a maintenance man, or the poor old woman. It was rectangular in shape, taking up the entirety of the vent it resided in. There were 2 eyes and a mouth, but no nose. It just sat there, staring at me with its bright white teeth. Slowly an arm, too much like a baby's arm, emerged from underneath it, before putting a chubby pink finger to its lips. Another arm, a much more gangly one, squeezed out from above it, stretching out towards the vent cover in my hand. I let the object slip out of my hand, watching as the thing pulled it back over its face and disappeared from view. Day 1. I hit a deer on my way to work. It's actually very common where I live in. Rural area, woodsy, trees lining the road that are just perfect for concealing a deer until the moment it leaps in front of your vehicle. Apparently at least 2 are hit and killed each day. My cousin and grandparents have all done it, some multiple times. So I guess it was just a matter of time before I did. I was already running a few minutes late, putting off leaving as much as I dared. I opened the garage and stared at the black trees silhouetted against an inky sky while I slipped on my shoes. It's spooky. Waking up at 5 a.m. to a pitch black world. I reversed the car, turning as I backed up to make a turn in my driveway. I didn't bother to look back, 'cause nothing's ever there. I know my driveway. Well, I thought I did. I cussed and braked. That was either the low stone wall in front of the garden or something else. Probably a deer. I pumped the brake lights and looked through the back window. Nothing. I was already a few minutes late and figured I'd either come home to a deer in my driveway or some other damage on the house, and I drove off. I came home to neither. On the plus side, the car was fine. Day 7. I saw a deer today on my afternoon jog. I work the early morning shift but have the afternoons off, and I make a genuine effort to exercise daily, no matter how tired or drained I feel. I often see deer hanging out in people's yards or the woods, so it wasn't an unusual sight. What was unusual was the injury on the back of her right leg. It looked broken, with dried blood coating her side. I felt a stab of pity, but the way she watched me made me more uneasy. She didn't flinch, stood like stone and stared. Despite the heat of my run, my skin was cold. At the end of the block, I glanced back to put my stomach at ease, and I saw nothing, just the neighbor, standing at the garden bed, staring back at me. Day 12. I've been seeing deer on every run I take. Every morning on my long drive through the middle of nowhere to get to work, my brights catch them on the side of the road. I think that's normal. They don't have any natural predators, unless you count cars. I haven't seen my bloody friend since last week, and I'm assuming she's dead. These deer, though, the way they watch me makes my skin crawl. I refuse to let it get to me, however. Totally irrational. I probably just have some primal instincts when I get close to wild animals or something. Fortunately, I can blast my music and run faster. Anyways, wherever I see deer and check again, the deer's gone. Probably scared off by the appearance of a neighbor or two who's shown up. They'd help if anything happened. Day 13. What I wrote yesterday. I know deer are night creatures, but that cannot explain what I saw this morning. I opened the garage, and on the edge of the light cast by my garage was a massive deer, standing and moving slightly in my yard. I jumped from my car and sped the hell out of my driveway. Miraculously, they didn't run in front of me, just watched. My hands were slipping on the wheel throughout my drive, and my heart continued to pound at work. And it wasn't the caffeine. I've stopped running after work. Day 17. I'm so embarrassed right now. I'm in tears. Since yesterday morning, I've been staying inside the house as much as possible and entertaining myself in my room. I was looking out front through my window this evening, considering how quickly I can get into my car and through the driveway, when I saw the mass of deer again. Only this time, and I know what I saw. There were about 3 people standing with them. I called 911 and gaspingly told them what I saw out front. 3 police cars, apparently having nothing better to do, showed up, but the people and deer were gone within seconds of me calling. Typical. I spent over an hour with the police. I made it seem like this was the first time I'd seen deer act like this. No, I didn't recognize anyone, and no, I didn't want to talk with anyone. I saw the people trespassing and freaked out. The police finally seemed to buy that, and they backed off. Day 19. I was supposed to leave for work about 30 minutes ago. It's pitch black, but I can just make out their inky forms in the woods, barely circling the light coming from my window. They're moving forward, pressing closer. No one will believe me. I can't prove anything. All that I do know is there's one woman, staring directly at my window, who's come closer than the others have dared. A woman with a limp and dirty, matted jeans. I haven't left my apartment in almost 6 weeks. My employer called me 3 weeks ago to tell me I was fired. My parents have called me 18 times. My sister called me 10 times. My best friend has called me 6. I have not answered any of them. I can hear it creep around outside as I write this. It started 5 weeks and 4 days ago. I woke up at 6 a.m. that day. My day began like any other. I stood up, made myself some breakfast and tea, and then went back to take a shower. When I was ready, I put on my regular homeware and sat down to watch TV for an hour, waiting for my hair to dry. A look onto my alarm clock told me that it was about time to get ready for work, so I dressed up, packed my needed belongings, and put on my shoes. Just as I reached out to grab the doorknob, a strange noise broke the silence of my soon-to-be empty apartment. It made me stop in my tracks. What I heard is hard to describe, but have you ever heard the bloop? The bloop is a sound recorded by hydrophones near the Bransfield Strait. If you haven't, take some time to listen to it. It is a somewhat metallic, shaking sound, yet still somehow similar to the singing of a whale or something. It's about as difficult to describe as what I heard that day, but yeah, that is what it sounded like. My mind was racing with fear. It could just as well have been some electronic device I had left on by accident, but the sound had shaken something deep inside me, and now that very something was telling me that it would be best for me to not proceed any farther. Frozen, I stood there, right in front of my apartment door, my hand still hovering a few inches above the doorknob. Then I heard it again. It was louder this time. It was then that I became aware of it coming from right outside my door. Slowly, I took a step backwards, dropping my purse to the ground. Quickly, I reached for the key, slammed it into the keyhole, and turned it around twice, double locking the door. Then I grabbed the chain hanging from the wall next to the door frame and sank it into its own lock, securing the door once again. Now that I finally felt safe enough to take a look through the peephole, I stood up on my tiptoes and peered outside. At first, I saw nothing unusual. There were the stairs, the door to the flat on the opposite side of mine. Suddenly, I caught something moving with my peripheral vision. Struggling to get a better look at it, I rolled my eye. Just as I began feeling a numb pain in the back of my head, I saw it. It did not look like anything I had ever seen before. I'm not even sure I could describe it as anything close to what it looked like. It's just one of those things you would need to see with your own eyes to fully understand its appearance. Even though if I were you, I would pray to never have to encounter it. It was a cloud of thick, black and dark blue mist. At least that's what I thought it to be at first. But as I finally became able to focus on it, I noticed that there was something moving underneath it. I broke into a sweat and felt my wet hand was clutching the doorknob so tightly it almost hurt. I stood there for what felt like hours, watching the entity hover outside. I think I must have cramped up since I don't remember moving an inch. As I finally came to my senses, I stumbled backwards and fell down, cursing myself for the following thumping noise. The thing let out its weird gurgle again. I was panicking. I grabbed my cell phone, ready to call the police, but halted. What would I tell them? What could they even do? Suddenly, I had an idea. There was no need to tell them it was a weird cloud thing, just a potential intruder. Dialing 911, I took a deep breath. A voice greeted me. 911, what's your emergency? Struggling to regain my voice, I whispered, "There's someone outside my apartment door. They're trying to get in. Please come quick." I quickly added my address. "Of course, miss. We'll have someone on their way immediately. They'll be there in 5 minutes. Have you locked the door?" "Yeah." "Good. Find a place to hide. Preferably your bathroom if it can be locked as well. I will stay on the phone with you." No, I don't want to be too loud," I answered in a low, hoarse tone. "If that makes you feel safer, all right. The police are on their way. Everything is going to be okay. Do not panic." I hung up. A place to hide. I needed to be there when the cops showed up. I needed to stay where I was. I stood up again and pressed myself against the door, my eye hovering in front of the peephole. It wasn't too long until I could hear loud steps erupting from the second-floor hallway, making their way up the stairs. The cops. I couldn't see them through the peephole, but I was sure of it. Suddenly the steps halted. "Oh my God," I heard a male voice say. "Stay where you are," another one shouted. They were answered by the creature's sound, but it was louder than before, deeper, and even more threatening. I closed my eyes. A crashing sound, then screams, then a loud, disgusting tearing noise, as if tissue was ripped apart. Then silence. As I dared to open my eyes again and peered through the peephole once more, a gruesome sight was awaiting me. Blood. There was blood everywhere. Amidst a vomit-inducing pile of what looked like you'd find at a butcher's, there were pieces of dark cloth, which must have once belonged to a uniform. That was all I needed to see. I sank to the floor and rolled up to a ball, sobbing and shaking. I have not left my apartment since. I barely eat anything, yet still I'm slowly running out of food. I have thought about exiting through the window somehow, but I'm on the 3rd floor and I don't have anything I could use as a rope to get down there safely. I don't want to call anyone for help. I don't want this thing to kill any more people. I don't think it'll go away either. It would have already if it really wanted to. But somewhere inside me, there's still a bit of hope. I wonder how the other tenants are doing. I would have noticed them leaving, so I guess they're hiding in their homes like I am. The thing is still outside. It has gotten 3 more police officers, unlucky enough to be sent to our address. I wonder who called them. Maybe another tenant, maybe my parents or my sister. My family is probably worried sick about me. In case things go wrong, I hope they won't be too sad. I hope they'll be able to recover.